Welcome back to my channel. This will be my update draft for Fantasy Premier League in the 2025-26 season, and there have been several podcasts uploaded on the channel already, ranging from the best goalkeepers, defenders, midfielders and forwards. There was my preliminary draft before the game was even released, of course my original draft once everything was set in motion, the FPL launch stream, and there is much more headed your way. If you want to see a video covering the best summer signings, differentials, budget players, all in their separate sort of videos, then let me know down in the comment section below. And I'm also open to different types of podcasts on top of it, with a lot of ideas already in mind. And I am going to be on holiday, but the plan is still to get the main bits of content out there on the channel. And of course, for the Gameweek 1 deadline stream, I'll be going live around 2 hours before the deadline, and it should be a blast as always. I'll be answering all your questions. This is the most interactive FPL YouTube channel that you can find. The same goes for UCL Fantasy, and the Champions League will return very soon. Like this video, subscribe to my channel, and also hit the notification bell so you're always up to date with my content, whether it's for those two fantasy formats or something else entirely, like the Club World Cup, which I covered throughout the summer. And on screen you can see the teams with the best fixtures from Aston Villa, Brentford, Chelsea, Sunderland and West Ham, but there are also some very difficult fixtures for the likes of Arsenal, Brighton, Crystal Palace and Man United over the first 5 game weeks. All of this has been addressed in my Key Changes to FPL podcast, where I also talk about defensive contributions, tweaks to the bonus point system and much more. So there's plenty of FPL content to look forward to, and also videos that have already been published on the channel. But without further ado, let's jump straight into it. With extra chips this season, it's certainly viable to use one in Game Week 1, such as the bench boost, which might be very popular, and I'm considering having 2 4.5 million goalkeepers to facilitate that booster. But at this moment in time, Robert Sanchez has made way for Sells, who is at the same price tag of 5 million, and both of them are ranked in my best goalkeepers video. They're very close in the rankings, around the podium of the best goalkeepers in the game, so be sure to check that out. But I think Sells is overall the best. If you look at Nottingham Forest's opening fixtures, they're quite solid, and also the points potential, because he makes so many saves, and I think he can also accumulate a lot of bonus points. Only Jordan Pickford scored more in the goalkeeper position last season, so I think Sells is still a great pick, but you've got multiple ways of covering that Forest defence, with Aina and Nico Williams also priced at 5 million, and it might be worth spending an additional 0.5 on the likes of Milenkovic or Murillo, who can also get defensive contribution points, especially in the case of the Brazilian, and Milenkovic has the attacking potential with 5 goals and 2 assists in the previous campaign. But amongst goalkeepers, I think Sells is still right up there, and it's difficult to rank too many goalkeepers higher than him, in my personal opinion, and it will be a very close toss-up between these two as the best 5 million goalkeeper in the game. Right now I do lean towards Sells, and that's why he does feature in this update draft, and the highlighted defender transfer is actually Virgil van Dijk to Milos Kerkez, and it's also very similar, and it will open up this debate about, do we go for the attacking fullback with more potential to get assists and also bonus points, or someone like Van Dijk who is going to get even more starts. I would argue he's also got bigger goal threat than Milos Kerkez, but also the defensive contribution points will change things in FPL this season, so you can consider defensive midfielders, and particularly these centre-backs like Maria, who I just discussed, Lacroix from Crystal Palace, and Virgil van Dijk is yet another option who could be right up there amongst the highest scoring defenders in the game. So that's something I need to also weigh up, and the same goes for the midfield. I'm quite keen on 6.5 million options as my 3rd, 4th or 5th choices, and Ndai has been reclassified from a forward to a midfielder, and he's also on penalties. He got no assists last season, but 9 goals, and I think he will get even more this time round, and I also think the bonus points potential is quite high with him. But the same goes for Mitoma, who accumulated over 20 big chances in the previous campaign. Both him and Welbeck are the standout Brighton attackers, especially after the sale of Joao Pedro, and Mitoma can play on both flanks, but especially on the left. He's one of the best dribblers in the Premier League, very good to watch, and he can translate that to FPL returns, which is the most important thing, and I think he's certainly worth considering. But Brighton don't have the easiest of fixtures over the first 5 game weeks, and that could be enough to put you off this Mitoma pick, and the same goes for Welbeck up front. And speaking of which, my forward transfer is something all of you will be on board with, Jarrod Bowen making way for Erling Haaland. There's a massive difference in price, so that means a sacrifice from my first draft in order to make this happen, but it is possible to have the likes of Palmer and Salah in the same team, and the same goes for one of those and Erling Haaland, and still maintaining a balanced 15-man squad. That's something I want to discuss in future podcasts, but in this case, only 2 of these premium options are in this team, so I haven't gone for 3 of them at the same time, and it might not be exactly what you're looking for. There's always going to be someone out there saying, why do you not have a Man City asset? And that was the case in my first draft. Others might say, you need to have Mohamed Salah, he's absolutely essential, but you have to make some compromises somewhere down the line, and in order to get Erling Haaland, I have sold one of the very best options in Fantasy Premier League history. But let's build this starting 11 and then talk about the bench with this updated draft. And between the sticks, one of my favourite options is Matt Sells. I think he's going to be one of the highest scoring goalkeepers in Fantasy Premier League this season. He might not reach the same heights as he did in the previous campaign, as I'm expecting Nottingham Forest to drop off a little bit, but he should still be able to keep more than 10 clean sheets, get some bonus points, and rival the likes of Jordan Pickford and David Raya as the 3 best goalkeepers in the game. But it's certainly viable to have 2 rotating 4.5 million goalkeepers, especially for a Gameweek 1 bench boost, and that's something I haven't completely ruled out. It's just Petrovic, who might be my favourite of the lot. He's facing Liverpool away in Gameweek 1, so that complicates the Gameweek 1 bench boost slightly, I think, in terms of having those 2 4.5 million goalkeepers. But maybe you go for Sells as your main goalkeeper and then a backup like Verbruggen or another 4.5 million option like Kelleher, and you're kind of hoping for a goalless draw between Nottingham Forest and Brentford. But going into my defensive line, this is quite similar to the structure I discussed in my preliminary draft, but Collins does make it into the starting 11 here. He is on the other side in this Forest versus Brentford fixture, but he could still get a lot of points through clearances and all these defensive actions to get those defensive contribution points. Collins was outstanding last season for Brentford. He played every single possible minute, and he also got so many defensive contribution points, so he could easily get 150 plus FPL points this season. But Levi Colwill isn't really that good in terms of these metrics, and that could hinder him as an FPL asset. It might be worth spending an extra million on Mark Cucurella, but my premium defender right now is Milos Kerkez, and Liverpool's opening 3 fixtures aren't great, but I'm still backing them for a clean sheet potentially in Gameweek 1 against Bournemouth, and I think from Gameweek 4 onwards against Burnley away, it gets much better for the Premier League champions. But Colwill is really there just to cover Chelsea defensively, and he's a cheap entry point into that defensive line. But in isolation, you'd rather cover that defence with Robert Sanchez in goal and maybe Mark Cucurella at 6 million. All the defenders have also been ranked in a separate podcast. But going into the midfield, I've gone for Saka, Rodgers, Mitoma, and Florian Wirtz. So there's no Cole Palmer in this draft, and he definitely has a case of being in here, but he costs 0.5 million more than Saka, who is still worth considering, and having 1 or 2 Arsenal players is still a pretty decent strategy because they face Leeds at home in Gameweek 2, but that's where the free hit could also come into play, and I discussed a very rough draft for the Gameweek 2 free hit in my first draft video towards the very end. Rodgers is someone who returns to my squad technically after I discussed him in my preliminary draft, and I do think Aston Villa are worth having 1 or 2 players, maybe even a triple up with Ollie Watkins up front. And Mitoma, I think, is very underrated and could be one of the best assets to start the season, irrespective of Brighton's kind of challenging and mediocre start, so to speak, when you look at the FDR, the fixture difficulty rating. But I think Wirtz will get off to an absolute flyer and really start this campaign strongly. 8.5 million is just way too underpriced for him, and he could easily be one of the highest scoring midfielders in FPL this season. He was ranked in the top 5 of my best midfielders video, but there is definitely a debate that he could be a little bit lower overall because you've got Premier League proven players who are ranked a little bit lower, but that's what it's all about. Opinions do shape FPL and football. In my forward line, I've got Solanke, Haaland, and Joao Pedro. I think that's one of the strongest front lines you can start the season with, but you've also got Victor Gyökeres, priced at 9 million, which is arguably a little bit underpriced, and I think it's a very good one actually. It gives you something to think about. Alexander Isak coming in at 10.5 million. It doesn't look like he'll stay at Newcastle, and it's very likely he'll move to Liverpool, which could change the whole Salah dynamic, and also Isak not having the penalties would make him a little bit less appealing. He's also not going to be the talismanic figure at Liverpool, but he can still be in amongst the bonus points on a consistent basis. But Erling Haaland would be the go-to captain in this scenario. If you're spending 40 million or above on either Salah or Haaland, you better captain him pretty much every single week. There could be the odd exception, like Saka in Gameweek 2 against Leeds United, but more often than not, you're going to go for the premium, and Haaland just gives you that security with the captaincy. And despite having his worst season in the previous year, he started off on fire scoring braces and hat-tricks every single week for the opening 5 game weeks. So I think Erling Haaland is still worth starting the season with, and João Pedro had a brilliant start to his Chelsea career, as he showed in the Club World Cup. He faces Crystal Palace at home in Game Week 1, which isn't easy, but the Blues boast a great record against the Eagles, and Dominic Solanke is a very good pick on paper, and I think Thomas Frank will get the best out of him. But what about that 3-day rest or kind of intermission between the PSG final in the UEFA Super Cup and then Burnley at home in Game Week 1? So only having a few days rest like that could mean a lot of rotation, and I think Spurs will heavily prioritise that final and rotate against the newly promoted club. So let's wait and see what happens there. But the same applies to Kudus, who is one of the outstanding 6.5 million midfielder picks, but Solanke could rival him in terms of value and be the best Tottenham Hotspur asset overall. It's also possible to have even more headaches in the forward line this season, because beyond those that I've just mentioned and the 3 forwards on screen, you've got Chris Wood at 7.5 million. He scored 200 FPL points last year. The likes of Cunha have been reclassified from a forward to a midfielder, which does help a little bit, but you've also had Jarrod Bowen, who has actually gone the other way round. He is now a forward, and I just sold him from the first draft to this one, but he's still heavily under consideration, and I know West Ham aren't reliable, but Bowen is a very consistent pick, and he's probably one of the best wingers in the Premier League. But being out of position in a negative sense, in his case, does make him a little bit less appealing, to be fair, and you've got even more options where that came from, like Visser, who is linked to Newcastle, and it looks like he's going on strike technically at Brentford, but irrespective of his final destination, he's still going to be a quality FPL asset, and you've got even more where that came from, like Danny Welbeck as another prime example. I have ranked the top 20 forwards in FPL in a separate video, so be sure to check that out as well. But on my bench, I've got Darlow. The 4 million goalkeeper dream is over. You have to spend at least 4.5 million with the signing of Perry from Lyon, so I think Darlow definitely goes down in our estimation, but it's just a 4 million goalkeeper, right? And if you go for Keller as your main choice, you might as well go for Valdimarsson as the backup, just in case, and you've kind of got the goalkeepers all covered there. And I very much doubt that people will look to triple up on Brentford, despite the fact that Visser could stay in the end. You've got Collins at the back and a few other decent options like Kevin Schade in the midfield. But I've got Reinders as my 5.5 million rotating option, so that means I've got 2 Man City players in this draft and going about things a little bit differently. But Reinders scored 10 goals in Serie A last season. He did fairly well in UCL Fantasy, and I think he can get some defensive contribution points too. And if he plays alongside Rodri, Man City will win most games, but dominate possession, and of course that could arguably lead to a downturn in defensive contributions. And ultimately with that metric, especially with the centre-backs, you're kind of favouring those teams that surrender possession like Nottingham Forest and Everton. But I still think Reinders will be a quality FPL asset, and he could be one of the best options in terms of value at 5.5 million in this position. I've also got Konsa and Reinildo Mandava, but it might be worth going for Esteve from Burnley instead. I think with defensive contributions he will be better, but Mandava was a quality UCL fantasy asset a few years ago with Atletico Madrid. He got so many ball recoveries and he offered insane value at 4 million euros at the time. So I think he could translate that to some decent returns in Fantasy Premier League, and Sunderland have really appealing opening fixtures, the best of any of the newly promoted sides, especially compared to Burnley, who have such a challenging start, facing Tottenham away, of course, in Game Week 1. But I'm quite happy with the structure and this 15-man squad. The biggest downside is no Mohamed Salah, and even with Cole Palmer, you might argue he's better to start this season than Bukayo Saka. Both of them are also ranked very closely in the best midfielders list. There isn't much separating them, but I think Palmer does have better goal-scoring potential. He's also on penalties, definitively, whilst with Arsenal we've seen Gyökeres, of course, come into the mix, and before that Odegaard and Saka were sharing the penalties, so that's something else to also bear in mind. But with the captaincy, Erling Haaland is the absolute standout against Wolves away. From my team anyway, you could argue that Salah is the best overall facing Bournemouth at home, and that's where Wirtz comes in as my vice-captain. Saka isn't a bad shout, even Solanke at home to Burnley, but the minutes could be a big concern, and João Pedro against Crystal Palace at home could be another decent option. The same goes for Cole Palmer if you choose to go for him, and there are so many different choices. I think the captaincy is quite open for Game Week 1, but no one has a better record in opening fixtures than Mohamed Salah, so I could feel the burn from the get-go if I decide to go without him for the second consecutive season in Gameweek 1. But like many of you, I'll be tinkering with my FPL drafts from now until the Gameweek 1 deadline. And do you prefer this setup compared to my first draft with Mohamed Salah and Cole Palmer? Of course, no Erling Haaland was there. The forward line might have been slightly weaker, but the midfield definitely looked a bit stronger on paper. But ultimately, as I always say, you have to make some compromises somewhere down the line. And in terms of prices, I always kind of keep track of this even when the season is fully underway and we see these price falls and rises. These team selection videos and these first drafts and stuff like that will always give you an indication of things to look out for. But Sells comes in at 5 million. Darlow is a 4 million backup goalkeeper, but nothing more. He won't start for Leeds United this season. Collins and Colwill are also priced at 5 million, and Kerkez is the joint most expensive defender in the game, alongside Saliba, Gabriel, Van Dijk, Frimpong, Gvardiol, and Nuri. Bukayo Saka does come in at 10 million this time round, and Rodgers has seen a significant price increase to 7 million, whilst Matoma has kind of remained fairly stable at 6.5 million. I think Wirtz is underpriced at 8.5. Solanke comes in at 7.5 after a disappointing season, but I think he'll get back on track. Joao Pedro also comes in at the same price tag, and Erling Haaland has seen a price decrease. Yeah, he's the second most expensive player in the game, coming in at 40 million. I think Reinders could offer outstanding value at 5.5. Konsa is 4.5 as you'd expect, and Renildo Mandava is 4 million. So I think him and Esteve from Burnley would be two of the best options from newly promoted clubs. Maybe you want to see a video dedicated to these players from Burnley, Sunderland, and Leeds United. If that's the case, then let me know down in the comment section below. But the last part of this segment really is about expected points, and these are taken by the website Fantasy Football Hub. And in goal, Sales has a 3.9 expected points figure against Brentford at home. Collins has 3, which is quite low, but I think he could be fairly underrated because he is a great option in terms of defensive contribution points. Colwill has 4.1, but it might be worth going for Lacroix instead, because I know Chelsea away will be difficult for Crystal Palace and you would favour the Blues to win this game, but I think longer term, Lacroix will still get good points in the difficult fixtures, and Crystal Palace have a somewhat challenging start over the first 3 game weeks. Kerkez has 4.3, and he is ranked a little bit higher than Virgil van Dijk, according to several websites like FPL.team, and Saka is actually the highest of any of these players at 6.4, despite facing Man United away from home. Rodgers and Mitoma are identical at 4.2 and 4.3 respectively, and Wirtz has 5.2. Erling Haaland is quite low in my opinion at 5.9. I think he could easily be higher than that, but Wolves are quite solid under Vitor Pereira, and I do expect a downturn this season and it could get a little bit messy, but he did a really good job in the back end of last season. Solanke has 5.1, and Joao Pedro is also just narrowly behind at exactly 5. Darlow isn't really worth talking about. I would expect that to drop down to 0 very soon. He currently has 1.3. Reinders has 3.3, which is the same as Semenyo, and that's another option I was considering. So maybe going for Tierno Barry from Everton instead of Solanke, and then having someone like Semenyo in my ranks over Reinders, and that gives me a little bit more depth arguably, but I also think it weakens my forward line significantly. Konsa has 3.2 expected points, and Renildo Mandava is slightly higher at 3.3, but a lot of this is definitely up in the air, and you could arguably start one of those 2 defenders on my bench instead of Collins, but I think sometimes having a defensive contribution machine like Lacroix, also Murillo, Milenkovic and Collins, it might be worth starting these players when they have difficult fixtures, and the same goes for Caicedo or Elliot Anderson in the midfield, maybe even Reinders, but I think defensive contribution points does change the game this season, and it's great to see. Not every single modification to FPL in this campaign has been great, but there's no doubt that this one might be one of the best changes in recent years. If you enjoy FPL planning, I would highly recommend the website FPL.team. It's a great resource to preview future game weeks, and I'm surprised the FPL website hasn't incorporated this already. You can also compare different transfer plans, and you might not have an entire 15-man squad yet, like you don't have these players in your pre-existing team, but you can still include them and play with things and maybe even visualize how things would look like in Gameweek 38. That's pretty much the extent of how much research and also comparisons you can do with this website. So Sells would be away to Crystal Palace in Gameweek 2. I would also have an entire backline of away players in Kerkez, Colwill and Renildo Mandava facing Newcastle, West Ham and Burnley respectively. Saka is a prime option for the captaincy, facing Leeds at home. I've also got Wirtz away to Newcastle, Rodgers facing Brentford away, and Mitoma having a trip to Everton, with João Pedro and Solanke also away from home, and Erling Haaland is another great option for the captaincy, facing Tottenham at home. On my bench is Darlow away to Arsenal, but I don't expect him to play. Reinders, of course, facing Tottenham, Collins at home to Aston Villa, and Concert is in the same fixture, facing Brentford away. And the expected points is quite low, at 49.2. I am open to free hitting in this game week, but if that's the case, I don't think it's worth going for Saka in Game Week 1 because Arsenal's opening 6 fixtures are really tough, and if you do free hit in Game Week 2, the main appeal would be tripling up on Arsenal with Gyökeres up front, Saka in the midfield, and any of their defenders like Gabriel if he's fit enough to start this season. So I think a lot depends on my final draft and going into the team selection, locking things in during the deadline stream. That will also kind of lock in certain things, like if I'm free hitting in Game Week 2, do I bench boost in Game Week 1, which is another possibility. I might even do both and then wildcard very shortly. But if you want to see a chip strategy podcast as well, then let me know down in the comment section below. As always, I'm quite open to doing it, and a lot of graphics are already prepared for such a video, and they will be discussed in deadline streams and throughout the season anyway. Things do change, and it's also worth splitting things into one half of the season and then the second one, because we do have double the amount of chips this time round, and from Game Weeks 1 to 19 you can use the triple captaincy or the bench boost. The same goes for the wild card, of course, and the free hit, but Game Week 1 is the only exception because we have unlimited transfers at our disposal. And I'm also going to visualize things, compare different drafts, and also look at Game Week 3 onwards. It's really important to kind of have a visualization of how your squad would look like in terms of the fixtures. Not everything is played on paper, especially this season, and fixtures might be slightly different this time round with defensive contribution points for defenders and midfielders, and the tweaks to the bonus point system could also mean things are more varied, and we have to approach things a little bit differently and adapt with FPL in the new season. We have reached the end of this FPL video and podcast. There's a lot more for you to look forward to, both for this game and UCL Fantasy, especially in late August to early September, when the season is fully underway with weekly deadline streams, reactions, team selections, wildcard squads, and transfer tips, with additional content on top of it, with chip strategies, free hits, you name it. And for UCL Fantasy, there will be limitless teams every single week, unless we get big changes in the Champions League this season. They will all be covered on my channel though, so you won't miss a single step for any single game week or match day for those two fantasy formats. Thank you very much for watching this video and listening to this podcast. If you enjoyed it or found it insightful, then like this video, subscribe to my channel, and also the notification bell so you're always up to date with my content for UCL Fantasy, FPL, and the World Cup next summer. Let's try to get this to over 200 likes, and let's keep on pushing towards new goals like 34,000 subscribers. Follow me on X, Instagram, Blue Sky, DylanRCM, and check all the links in the description for my Patreon and the championships, further access to my videos, amongst many other perks. The Discord server, FPL League, and Spotify can also be found in the description. I'll see you very soon for even more FPL content, and keep your eyes peeled for the Game Week 1 deadline stream.